Thank you. It's really a pleasure to be here. As Fiona told you, I came very close to being on the other side of this microphone. My mother remarried when I was very young, and in fact I grew up with my stepfather's last name. He was an attorney, and although it was in fact a rather unhappy marriage, I never held that against all lawyers. And it did engender an early interest in the law. Over the last 12 years at Playboy, and I think especially the last 5 years since I became president, I've probably spent more hours with lawyers than any of you have, and have learned more than in some cases I wanted to know about certain aspects of the law. Sometime, if you buy me a drink, I'll tell you what I know about bankruptcy law, since our former partner in New Jersey defaulted on $40 million of receivables owed to Playboy. And I've gotten a little bit of an education in areas of trademark law and in areas of international law and securities law and tax law and lots of different aspects of law as it interrelates with business. I think, not surprisingly, increasingly, law and business are intertwined. But I suppose partly because Playboy is a media company and partly because of my own interests, I've become most involved in areas of law in civil liberties, and particularly the First Amendment. I sit on the Illinois affiliate board of the American Civil Liberties Union and on something called the President's Committee of the ACLU, and I enjoy the intellectual debate at those meetings as well as the ability to support the activities of the ACLU as much as almost anything that I do. So I thought what I would do this evening before opening it up to questions is to talk a little bit about some changes that have been happening in media, since we are all consumers of media, even though I may be rare among us as a producer of media, and also how that interrelates with some First Amendment issues that I think have some importance to all of us, regardless of what particular fields that you all choose to go into. And what I want to talk about is the tension between the guarantees of the First Amendment and the desire that many people in society have to live in an environment where they aren't forced to confront ideas or images that they find not just challenging, but truly objectionable and unpleasant. I think what's at stake in a very real way is the concept of a free marketplace of ideas, but also what's at stake is the concept of tolerance and how one defines morality with a capital M. I don't agree with some people who write and speak about the First Amendment and censorship as if it were an issue that was amoral, that one couldn't impose morality on it, one simply has to tolerate all things. I think there is a moral component to it, but my definition of morality, for what that's worth, has a good deal more to do with tolerance, compassion, honesty, equality, and charity than it does with believing that I alone know the best ideas to share with everybody else in society. So I don't walk away from morality as having a factor in this discussion. I simply would argue that perhaps the concept of morality, like the concept of the family, has been preempted inappropriately by some extreme views, and it really belongs to a much broader spectrum of views. The other aspect of, I think, what's at stake is something that makes the United States unusual and perhaps unique, and that is that the debate that we tolerate in our publications and in our speeches and conversation is rather rare, and it's that debate, I think, that has allowed the United States to tolerate and grow through some rather dramatic revolutions, but to grow in an evolutionary, not a politically revolutionary way. I mean, we have absorbed the women's movement, we have absorbed the sexual revolution, we have absorbed the civil rights movement, we've absorbed a good deal that in other forms of government for disenfranchised people to acquire rights they didn't previously have, or for broad social attitudes to be changed, requires considerably more than taking to writing and arguing. And I think that that too is relevant to what's at stake. The price for what's at stake is, as I mentioned before, a question of how bothered we as a body politic are by ideas and images that we find offensive. And those can be in lots of different places. They can be in textbooks, a battleground very current. They can be in comic books. They can be the lyrics of rock and roll records. They can be in films. They can be in magazines. And they can also be of many different characteristics. They can be satire. They can be about sex. They can be about violence. They can be blasphemous. They can be anti-American, as someone defines them. They can be libelous, as someone defines them. The issue of the tension between tolerance and freedom is hardly a new issue. I just went on the board of the Goodman Theater, which I mention only because the first play of the new season was a reinterpretation of Brecht's Galileo, which of course is all about the tolerance, or more to the point, the intolerance that society had for ideas that were labeled heretical about science. The Scopes trial, which in many ways seems so long ago, is in many ways today being rebattled, both in the issue of creationism and in the issue of secular humanism, which is something you've probably been reading something about in the papers. The notion of political speech being a target is also hardly anything new, going back many centuries, and more recently in our lifetimes almost. One can go back to McCarthyism and the label communist being applied to ideas and ultimately to people who were not perceived by those in power to be supportive of the goals of the United States, to today's environment in which the label terrorist is rather handily applied to not just people who practice acts of violence, but people who write certain things, people who aren't allowed to come into this country because they write certain things. And the issue of obscenity, which is very recent in a construct under the law, but in terms of attitudes about sex and sexuality, certainly not recent. Sex and sex education, contraception is an issue that's both timeless and timely. But there's something that's happened, I think, in the last couple of decades that has changed the environment, that makes the tension a little greater than it used to be. And I don't think those changes are going to be reversed, and therefore the tension that we are feeling right now, whether it's in textbook controversy or magazine and film dealing with sexuality or the issue of rock and roll, I don't think those issues are in any kind of cyclical nature going to go away in the near term. And the changes that I'm speaking of have to do really with two interrelated trends. One is the fragmentation of society, and the other is the fragmentation of the media. And they become important because it means that our society is less homogeneous and less conformist, if you will, than it was in even the 50s. And therefore, we are all brought face to face with a much greater variety of ideas and images in the media and in the heads of our neighbors than might have been expressed 30 years ago. What do I mean by that? Well, let me just use the last 30 years because, relatively speaking, they straddle the early 1950s when Playboy began into the mid-1980s. Let me take one aspect of society because it's such a fundamental aspect. I mentioned earlier the co-opting, in my perspective, of the concept of family. Well, what is family? Back in the 50s, family was a single institution, clearly understood, and unilaterally the same. It was Norman Rockwell's painting, and it was Dad, who went out and brought home the bacon, and Mom, who stayed home and took care of the kids, and two kids, and a turkey on the table, and a little dog. And more than 75% of the way we lived in our households, our families, if you will, were that family archetype. What's happened now in the 1980s? The percentage of families that meet that description is 7% today. 25% of families are single people living alone. In fact, the Census Bureau had to come up with a whole new designation for a kind of family because of what's happened in these intervening decades in terms of changing patterns of living together. Maybe you've heard of it. This is called POSSLQ, P-O-S-S-L-Q. This stands for People of Opposite Sex Sharing Living Quarters. This is now, you can fill out your census form, and if you're Apostle Q, you check that form. At the same time, what's happened then, just to take that as a microcosm, is that the varieties of the way we live our lives and our ideas about our lives, our lifestyles and our mind styles, if you will, have proliferated tremendously from my parents' generation and even more dramatically from their parents' generation. And if to some extent the archetype of this country used to be the great melting pot, I would say to you that the archetype of this society today is much closer to a mosaic, which is to say we may form a picture that you could put a frame around, but each of those tiles, whether they're regional variations or ethnic or age or family structure or social or political attitudes, are very different and very distinct. At the same time, not surprisingly, the media, which ultimately connects to each of us and serves us, has itself fragmented. Just in the last 5 years, there's been a 58% increase in the number of magazine titles. And today, only 6% of all magazines published have a circulation larger than 2 million. Well, if you think back to the 50s, there were a relative handful of magazines, and they were all huge circulation magazines. They brought everyone together in the family, the original Life, Look, Saturday Evening Post. They were magazines that everybody shared. Today, somebody in the family's got Working Woman, somebody's got Playboy, somebody's got Walking, somebody's got Boston Magazine, somebody's got Blue Boy. There are as many different magazine titles as there are segments of society. And at the same time, that kind of proliferation has even extended to the media that I think impacts us the most because of its intrusiveness into our lives, and that's broadcast media. Just 20 years ago, there were basically 3 networks in PBS. Today, even though the entire nation isn't cable yet, cable is reaching basically half the households in America, and there are 100 channels, and at least 30 of them are available to almost everybody who has cable. And that means everything from the PTL and the old gospel hour to American Ecstasy and X-rated movie service, and everything in between. At the same time, as I'm sure many of you are users of, there's been this phenomenal increase in the use of video cassette recorders and the ability to tape shows and bring shows into your home. In 1982, there were only 2 million VCRs out there. That's increased to 13 million last year and is expected to reach 85% of the households by 1995. Why do I go through this in a context of the First Amendment? I go through it because I think that it's had an impact on people's attitudes and on the realization that people have that they're face to face more obviously with political attitudes, with ideological attitudes that may not be their own, and it makes a significant number of people very uncomfortable. I want to take the particular area of obscenity because it's something that I think in many ways is the battleground for a lot of other kinds of issues of political disagreement. But it's the battleground because it's the one area that's content specific that starting in 1957 the Supreme Court held did not enjoy protection under the First Amendment. And I could, or probably more appropriately, a sociologist or a psychologist, could do a very interesting speech on why it is in this country we have no trouble at all going to see, to name a film I just saw recently, Lethal Weapon, with graphic scenes of torture and violence in them, and we never think twice about that being an acceptable form of entertainment. But we literally say the law shouldn't protect explicit scenes of people fucking. I think that's a rather interesting sociological thing about this country. It's not what I'm here to talk about, but it does say something that we are more obsessed, or as Peter Fonda once said, you can show a picture of a man cutting off a woman's breast, you just can't show a picture of him sucking it. So it is this unique form of expression that is the sexual, and I think it brings out some interesting political perspectives and some interesting legal issues, and I want to talk a little bit about that. I mentioned that it was only in 1957 that, in fact, the Supreme Court in Roth v. the United States created this concept of obscenity and said that it would not be protected under the First Amendment. And what's, I think, most notable about that is that the majority opinion was written by Justice Brennan. 16 years later, the court had another case and ruled again in 73 in a ruling that was basically supportive of the original ruling of obscenity. But why I mention that is that Justice Brennan stated 16 years later the following: "Our experience since Roth requires us not only to abandon our effort to pick out obscene material on a case-by-case basis, but also to reconsider a fundamental postulate of law, that there exists definable class of sexually oriented expression that may be totally suppressed by federal or state governments. I am forced to conclude that the concept of obscenity cannot be defined with sufficient clarity or specificity." Well, around that same time, some of you may remember that then President Johnson, followed by President Nixon, appointed a President's Commission to look at the subject of obscenity. And in fact, it was chaired by the dean of a law school, University of Minnesota, a rather conservative Republican dean, who chaired a commission that spent several years looking at the issue of obscenity. And did it in fact make sense that we were trying to define a category of material simply based on its content and exclude that from protection under the First Amendment? And after several years of study, the commission came back with a final report in which it found that there was no justification for the existing laws. In fact, it recommended that all such laws, both federal and state, be repealed because they couldn't find any harm associated with this class of material. What they did recommend, and I think this is interesting in comparison with the politics of the 1980s, what they did recommend strongly were advanced expansion of sex education, of information about sex and sexuality taught most importantly in the schools, but also in a broader context as well. Feeling very strongly that the nation was ill-informed and under-informed about sex and sexuality, and that pornography was not going to fill the role of providing information as a substitute for the schools. That commission was followed by a commission in Britain, and then one in West Germany, and one in Scandinavia, and they all came to basically the same conclusions. That brings us in a very expedited way into the mid-1980s, and something very different started to happen concurrent with these changes in the media and these changes in the fragmentation of society and the family that I want to talk about a little bit. I'm sure you've all heard about the Mies Commission on Pornography. There's some things about it that I think are especially important that have very little to do with the content of what's in the final report or even the impact of the final report. And mostly that has to do with kind of the politics of the First Amendment, if you will. People from the conservative perspective who have been long offended by ideas that encompass the possibility of moral sexual relations outside of marriage or not for procreation have been pretty consistently beating the drums to advocate their point of view. When Playboy started in the 1950s, there were citizens groups for decency who felt very strongly about the concept of sex, felt very strongly about the concept of birth control. In fact, Playboy funded Bill Baird's case that ultimately went to the Supreme Court that allowed for the right to give contraceptive information to unmarried women. That's not very new, and if you look at the public opinion polls, even though judging from the amount of attention the media gives to the fundamentalist movement, you might think that it's growing. The truth is that it's about 20% of the population that subscribes to that agenda of issues, criminalizing abortion, putting a mandated prayer back in the schools, repressing sexual material, repressing gay rights, repressing the feminist movement, et cetera, et cetera. It's not a particularly large percentage, but some things have happened that have fueled that momentum that ultimately resulted in a very interesting commission on pornography being formed. One was a change in the women's movement. There was a segment of the women's movement that went a direction attacking sexual imagery after coming out of a root of the women's movement that had a lot to do with celebrating our bodies ourselves, sexual freedom, women's right to have equal pleasure in the bedroom, women's right to have equal control over their own body in terms of carrying pregnancies to term. And at a certain point, the women's movement split, and a certain group of women went one direction in dealing with certain issues, and another group of women went another direction. And a group of women who went into a very strong anti-pornography direction gave the right an ally and a rhetoric that they hadn't had in the 60s, because of course the right has generally been perceived to be not an ally of the goals of feminism. So that was one thing that happened, but frankly I think that was the less important thing, only because the reality of it is that women as a class, never mind feminists as a group within women as a class, in fact still don't wield a lot of political power in this country, much as we might like to change that. We weren't, after all, able to even get the Equal Rights Amendment passed. So it isn't so much women or feminists that have changed the political debate on this subject. It's really Ronald Reagan. And Ronald Reagan's support for the Jerry Falwell, in the generic sense, agenda on these issues, and the mutual support back from the Christian Broadcast Group to Ronald Reagan. And that became important because all of a sudden, instead of being perceived as a fringe of society that had a rather intolerant view that it zealously pursued, there was a legitimization to the perspective that that group brought to a lot of issues. And one of the results of that was the creation of the Mies Commission, which became kind of a political forum. Let me just tick off some things that I mean by that, because I think it will have impact on all of our lives going forward. The problem that people focus on when they talk about why we need to suppress certain material is usually the problem of violence, because it's what all of us are concerned about. No one wants to be the victim of violence. Everyone feels that their rights must stop at the point where another person's rights are intruded upon. And in fact, the Mies Commission was very quick to comment on the fact that the reason why they were going to conduct this series of hearings was that sexual material in this country had become increasingly violent, and that had to be looked at as a possible cause of the actual violence that was out there in society. And I think a lot of people who may have read some of the press about it have that opinion as well. Well, the truth is that that's not the case, and it isn't a matter of conjecture, it's pretty much a matter of fact. The Kinsey Institute, for example, categorizes, based on the degree of violence, X-rated films, and finds about 8% of X-rated films, and now we're talking hardcore pornography here, have a violent content. Professor at Ohio University, Joseph Scott, did a much broader study of all films, because remember I talked about Lethal Weapon a moment ago in a different context. He found that of the MPAA categories of PG, PG-13, R, X, that X was the lowest in violence in its content. That if in truth what we were concerned about were images of violence and their possible impact on people in society, it didn't make a lot of sense to be looking at the category of sexual imagery. It made a lot more sense to be looking, in fact, at violence. In fact, there was even a study commissioned by the commissioners themselves to look at not Playboy per se, but the 13 largest selling magazines for men that had nudity in them, to prove that in fact there was an increased attention to violence and the link of violence and sexuality. And what happened when they got the results in was they found that less than 1% of all those magazines had any violent content in their sexual imagery. And interestingly, that piece of data simply disappeared from the final commission report, because it's much more politically acceptable and encouraging to talk about violence than it is to say what we're concerned about is sex. The other issue that the commission kind of exploited was the concern, again, that a lot of people have about child pornography. And there are a few things that people can think of that are more repugnant. And in fact, back in 1984, the Child Protection Act was passed, which made child pornography in and of itself a federal crime, separate from the act of child abuse. But the commission gave the impression, at least to casual readers, that this was a growing problem, and this was a reason why we needed to increase the lines that we drew around material that we were going to suppress for adults. Well, unfortunately for the commission's credibility, concurrent with their report came a 2-year study that a Senate subcommittee had on specifically the issue of child pornography. And in fact, what the Senate subcommittee found was diametrically opposed to the impression that the commission wanted to leave. And that is to say that what the Senate subcommittee found was that there is no child pornography to speak of produced in this country because of the criminal sanctions, that what is around is basically produced by people who are abusing children and are exchanging that material among themselves, and that the numbers of people involved in this are very small. Does that mean that it's not a problem? Of course not. But it means that it doesn't seem to be so much a problem of production of images in the media as it does to be, in fact, a problem of dealing with child abuse and child abusers. And in fact, if you think about it, not surprisingly, the people who do research into child abuse, whether it's Dr. John Money or Masters and Johnson, never look at images as a cause of the behavior. In fact, what John Money says is, if you show a pedophile a picture of the Sears underwear catalog, he will be aroused. The problem is not the picture, the problem is the person. And if you talk to Masters and Johnson, who have a very low rate of recidivism in dealing with parents who abuse their own children, they will tell you that what you have to do is acknowledge the problem and break the cycle of the abused child becoming the abusive parent, and that that's done with more open communication about sex, not more repressed communication about it. Dr. Morris Lipton, who was on the 1970 President's Commission, called the Meese report somewhere between a farce and a disgrace, which is pretty strong language, and I think is maybe apt, not so much because what it is so dangerous, but maybe to some extent because what it isn't is so dangerous. And what I mean by that is that if we're legitimately concerned about issues of violence and abuse, if we are morally outraged by them, then sidetracking people's concern away from the offenders and the causes of the offenses to the idea of talking about what's written about in books or shown in films is not only perhaps counterproductive, but it certainly isn't taking us any closer to solving those problems. And I think that's one of the things that's frustrated a lot of people who are working in areas of violence and abuse as much as anything else about this administration. Is this administration cuts funding for shelters for battered women, but is busy rhetorically posturing about its concern about abuse of women. And they seem perhaps a little incompatible. The other thing that seems a little inconsistent is the idea that one can find a link between what people see and what they do when we know that the problems of what they did predated by a long time the availability of any of this kind of material. And I want to quote a Chicago columnist, Mike Royko. For those of you who don't come from the Midwest, Mike Royko became infamous, so to speak, as having walked out of the Sun-Times after Rupert Murdoch bought it. Murdoch has since sold it. But Royko was the writer who said, no self-respecting fish would be wrapped in a Murdoch paper. So he's a man who speaks his mind, if you will. And he wrote, when I was a young crime reporter, I hung around police stations and watched the dregs drift by. They included every sort of sexual adventurer: rapist, peeper, flashers, child molesters, zoo invaders, and guys who wore pink negligees. Some were harmless, others were deadly. But one thing I never saw was a dirty book sticking out of anybody's pocket. So my question is, if pornography turns people into sex fiends, how come we had all of this sexual violence before the stuff was available? And there's something else that should be considered. For the past year, the men on the commission have been immersed in pornography. By now, they've probably seen more pornography than anyone in America. So I ask, who's watching these guys? There's a point here, which is that there's a big brother aspect about a lot of the censorship rhetoric here. And I find it ironic to talk about the issue of faith, because the people who are supportive of censorship are people who use faith with a capital F a lot. But I think it does have to do with whether or not you have faith in other adults' judgment or not. And it's ironic that a president that was hired in many ways to get government out of people's lives seems quite comfortable in putting government into not only their libraries, but their bedrooms. And I think that that's the context in which this has to be looked at, because the issues are not issues of violence or abuse. The issues really are issues of attitude and behavior in the area of sex. The most experienced member of the commission dealing with sex offenders, Dr. Judith Becker, wrote in a dissenting opinion, I believe some of the commissioners are simply trying to legislate their own personal morality. What does she mean by that? She says, the commission began with the ultra-conservative premise that a majority considered masturbation, oral genital sex, and sex between unmarried people to be harmful antisocial behavior. This means that our government is legislating or attempting to encourage legislation to suppress material because it might encourage you to masturbate, and that this is not healthy. Now, I don't really care what Ronald Reagan thinks about or does about masturbation, but I do care about the notion that he ought to extend his attitudes towards it into laws that not only control behavior, but control images and ideas about behavior. And the irony of this is that the whole population has accepted to a great extent a much more open attitude about sexual behavior and imagery, even at the same time that the politicians and the preachers are going off in a particular direction. There were more X-rated cassettes rented last year than people who voted for Ronald Reagan. Sexually explicit imagery is not any longer restricted to a tiny subclass in the society. With the advent of cable television, VCRs, greater variety of magazines, many Americans have, at one time or another, encountered sexual imagery and have not found themselves negatively affected by it. And yet we have a commission that's suggesting that there are serious harms associated with it. And I think what it comes down to is the difference between objectionable and harmful. Let me quote Royko one more time. Personally, I don't like pornography because I find it tasteless, embarrassing, and boring, not because I think it will turn me into a raging fiend. But that's no reason to ban it, because if being tasteless, embarrassing, and boring were a crime, we'd have to get rid of 90% of the TV shows and hit records, close down most of the franchised food joints, muzzle the politicians, and prohibit any preacher from talking more than 90 seconds. That is the point. If you look at cable TV programming surveys, more people are offended by religious broadcasters asking for movie than by adult movies. So where are you going to draw the line as to how many people it takes to find something objectionable? Alan Dershowitz wrote something that I think says it as succinctly as anything else. Our Constitution prohibits the government from protecting us from ideas, no matter how pernicious or offensive they may be. We must wait until those ideas ripen into action. Such waiting may involve costs, but all freedom involves cost. It's the cost of allowing citizens to choose what they want to read or view, and it's worth it. If you don't believe me, ask a citizen who lives under a regime of censorship. And I think that's especially relevant in an environment where there is less of a majority opinion about any issue than there used to be, and therefore the tolerance and protection for minority opinions becomes more necessary, or the social fabric tears apart. Well, where are the courts in all of this? Generally, I would say the courts have been pretty reliable in all of this. There was just a very important Supreme Court decision having to do with cable television, which was a review of a decision regarding whether or not the state of Utah and other states could prohibit the distribution of material that they considered indecent. Now, you might imagine that if obscenity itself is a rather difficult concept to apply, what two people might find to be indecent could be considered widely different. Phyllis Schlafly has been quoted as saying that she considers our bodies ourselves obscene. Jerry Falwell has been quoted as saying he considers sex education obscene. We aren't even yet into what they consider indecent. But the court, in fact, held that cable is not like network broadcast and radio broadcast because it is invited into the home, and because they are nationally distributed services. You cannot have this patchwork quilt of different standards, and that therefore the obscenity standard and it alone should be held in terms of what can be excluded from broadcast. And I think that that was a very important case in terms of the media. There's another case that's coming up before the court that's going to be very important, which is actually out of my home state. It's Pope versus the state of Illinois. And it's important because it has to do with the issue of what are community standards. Some of you may know that there's a three-pronged test for obscenity, and the last one is the question of whether it lacks serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value. And since the original decision, that has been taken to be a national standard, if you will. There is a case now that's coming up to the Supreme Court that is going to argue the possibility of making that a local standard. What does that mean? Well, let me give you a comment from Justice Scalia's questioning on this. And Justice Scalia and I don't see eye to eye on a lot of issues, but on this one I think he got to the heart of it. If there is a book or a film or a magazine that's being challenged in, say, Peoria, Illinois, and the Peorian film critic says, this film is smut, it's despicable, it's disgusting, and we, the good citizens of Peoria, don't want to see it. Can you introduce into evidence the fact that the New York Times film critic says this is a film of genius that is going to stand the test of time? Or must you only listen to the Peoria film critic? Now, this isn't the question of whether the Peorians find it offensive to their standards, which is one test, or whether the Peorians find it appealing to their prurient interest, which is a second standard. This is the question of evaluating the work and its value. And you can begin to imagine, knowing that it was not very many years ago that carnal knowledge was convicted of obscenity, that if individual communities can apply all those tests in a completely subjective basis, that you completely mitigate the ability to have national distribution of books, records, films, magazines, video material, because how can you know what a single community will find objectionable? Another case that's coming up is related to display, and that's the American Booksellers Association versus Virginia, and that's going to be an important case too. But I would say that in general, the courts, even with more conservative judges on them, have been fairly strict in terms of not expanding the class of material that is suppressed. As you probably know, Playboy filed suit actually twice this year against the government, and we won twice. One was to get congressional funding reinstated for the Braille edition of Playboy, which we don't really have anything to do with, but we helped with the American Congress for the Blind and the American Library Association on that. But the other and more relevant one was our suit against the Mies Commission and its efforts to intimidate retailers against selling constitutionally protected material. Because we are back to the starting place, which is that what's at stake here is not, in fact, child pornography, is not, in fact, violent obscenity, because those things are A, illegal, B, underground to begin with, and C, where they are not underground, are being aggressively prosecuted. What's at stake is the ability of the government to encourage communities to find perfectly legal products objectionable and to run them out of town. Since the Mies Commission report was filed, several thousand stores have thrown out rock and roll records and rock and roll magazines because Jimmy Swaggart considers it pornography and was able to launch a letter-writing crusade to the owners of the Walmart stores. The 7-Eleven stores, as you probably know, threw Playboy magazine out after receiving a letter from the Commission. And what ultimately happens is that the most vocal minority, now given some sanction from the government, winds up deciding whether The Nation is sold, Ms. Magazine, Playboy, American Photographer, a magazine that's been thrown out because it ran some photography that had nudity in it. You wind up with not only not a protection of the minority points of view, but the minority dictating to the majority. And ultimately, I think what will control what is the media environment we all live in over the next decade will be, to some extent, the courts, but to a much greater extent, the activism and the involvement and the attitudes of the citizenry at large, as a whole. Because at the end of the day, it is the people that will control the debate. And in fact, in many ways on these issues, the people are ahead of the politicians. Whether it's here in Cambridge or in South Dakota or in Maine, every time a referendum has been put up that is a choice between repressing material that some people find objectionable or maintaining a more open marketplace of legal products, the people have voted in favor of choice. And I think that if the people's voice continues to be heard, that choice will continue to be maintained. But at the end of the day, I think it's also important that people who are concerned focus on the real issues and the real individual responsibility for the concerns that are shared, the concerns of violence and of abuse. I'll give you a little story that I think illustrates the problem I have with the Crusaders really being interested in helping solve the problems. It's a program called Children of the Night that a sociologist started in Southern California that works to get child prostitutes off the street. She was doing a doctoral thesis on prostitution and couldn't believe how many of the prostitutes were minors. And I don't mean 16, 17, I mean 13, 14, 15-year-olds. And she found that what was happening was these were kids who were either runaways or were abused kids who were thrown out of their homes. They came to Hollywood because it's Hollywood. They had nowhere to stay, they had no money, and they were easy prey for pimps. And they got picked up in bus stations, and they were boys and girls alike. They got hooked on drugs, and they wound up working the streets because it was the only way to make a living. And what Lois thought was that if there were a way to give these kids an alternative, that she could get them off the streets. And she began by bringing them into her home, and then ultimately went out to the community to try and raise money to build a shelter. In fact, about a month ago, I think she was profiled in 60 Minutes, which was terrific. Anyway, I know about the program because she approached Playboy, because we have an LA office, and we became the first company to give them money and helped raise money from other companies. But I tell the story for this reason. When the Mies Commission was formed and they were looking for people to testify, they called Lois and said they wanted some of the kids to testify. And she said, you know what I'd really like would be some government support so that we could expand this program, because I really think we could break this cycle. And they said, no, we're not in the business of giving government money. We just want to have your kids testify. So she said, all right, well, what is it you want them to testify about? Because these are kids who have been pretty traumatized, and I want to have some feeling for what I'm getting them into. And the staffer said, well, we want them to talk about how their parents' use of pornography in the homes was what caused them to be abused, and which is what caused them to run away. And Lois said, well, I have to tell you that I've worked with thousands of kids now, and I just don't see that as a problem. Alcohol abuse is a problem. Drug abuse is a problem. Lack of programs to treat abusive parents is a terrible problem. But I have to tell you that I really haven't found pornography to be a problem. And they said, thank you, don't call us, we'll call you. And of course, her kids were never called to testify. Now, if you were seriously concerned about child abuse, wouldn't you be apt to do something different than that? I think the answer is an obvious yes. And I raise it because my perspective on this interrelated tension is not only to strongly argue that we protect the freedoms that are available to materials, whether they are objectionable or not, but that we simultaneously address with the resources that we need the social problems that are at the heart of what I think most people are concerned about. At the end of the day, it's those real programs that can make a difference. We got involved in something called the Citizens Committee for Victim Assistance back in the 70s in Chicago, which became the first program to capture evidence in rape trials and dramatically increased the rate of conviction from what it had been. And it was a private funded program done with the police and the hospital. And they couldn't get government support, they couldn't get church support. There are a million programs out there in communities across the country that, if they were seriously supported in a very short period of time, could make a profound difference. Because you only have to look at the experience in other countries that have no obscenity laws, never mind pornography ordinances, to find much lower rates of violence than we have in this country. And at the end of the day, it will be what we all do, both about the First Amendment and about the quality of our lives, that will control the society in which we live. Justice Learned Hand said, liberty lies in the hearts of men and women, and when it dies there, no law, no court can save it. I fervently hope that all of you who have a special place because of background that you have received here in this institution will understand and value the historical assessment of the Bill of Rights and the First Amendment, and respect and remain committed to the tolerance that it stands for, of a pluralism of ideas and of images, because ultimately it is that pluralism that I think makes this country the special place that it is. Thank you.
If you'd like to ask questions, we'd ask that you line up at the microphones and we'll alternate between them.
Or if you have a really loud voice, you can just stand up and shout. Okay.
I feel like you can argue against the pornography ordinances without distorting the position of in one particular way. That was in Clayton's contract against the 60s celebration of sexuality. And I think that if you take at least the feminist thing, I think that rather than accept what we buy, what we consider to be useful. And the third thing is, again, referring, sorry.
That's okay.
Your point of the First Amendment being a moral point. I'm wondering on the issue of morality. It seems that I'm just often very startled by the fact that you as a woman are head of Playboy. And I wonder if you personally, as a person who employs these individuals and pose in your magazine, if you would ever do that yourself.
Okay. That'll give me another half hour's worth of remarks. Let me try and respond to each of the questions. In terms of the feminist perspective on pornography, opinions. I think that the point I would make is, first of all, there's a very interesting periodical that's just been published by a group of feminists called Caught Looking. And it's a publication of a lot of shockingly explicit pornographic images, but in the opinions of the feminists who put it together, feminist pornography, if you will. Although most of it is heterosexual because most of it is older and deliberately so. And so the imagery, there was less lesbian imagery out there than there is now. I think that there are two things that trouble women about pornography, and I think they're both very understandable. One is the linkage of violence to sex, but the other, frankly, is broader, and it has to do with the fact that traditionally, women are used to being the lookies, not the lookers. And it is an imbalance that anybody who's a woman has dealt with at some time or another, whether it's walking by a construction site or looking at a pin-up in somebody's office. I think that that's not a particularly healthy balance, and I would hope that a number of the women who are interested in producing eroticism, whether it's on film or in print, would be encouraged and supported to do that, because what we are living with is a legacy of good girls aren't interested in sex that is very deep in this culture, that is very deep in the Judeo-Christian ethic. You know, there's the goddess on the pedestal and there's the whore, and only the whore really enjoys sex. You know, there's the good girl that you take home to mom and there's the bad girl that you go to bed with. And it's only been in a very recent time that women have been able to say, well, wait a minute, you know, we're interested in sex too, and we want good sex, and we are desiring at the same time we are desirable, and give us some opportunity to express that. I think if we lived in a culture where that was more aggressively expressed, all of us as women would be less sensitive to the fact that most of the sexual imagery that's out there, whether it's in Playboy or in film, is from a male perspective. And I think that that is a cultural bias, if you will, that only time, and I hope, women will change. In terms of the violence issue, it's more than just that there were crimes of violence before there was pornography. The evidence, whether it's research evidence or other countries' evidence, is pretty strong on the lack of any cause and effect. In fact, I just came back from Japan, and one of the sort of shocking things about Japan is that there is a very strong theme of violence and rape fantasies in their pornography, much stronger than in this country. And the rate of rape per capita in Japan is 1/16 in this country. What we forget is that we have a very high rate of violence in this country. And in fact, most of the victims of violence are men, not women. And I think one of the insights that feminists brought to this discussion that gets lost a little bit when you start talking about pornography is rape is not a sex crime. It's a crime of violence. It's a power crime. And just as it was wrong to suggest that it was relevant to question the victim as to whether she was wearing a short skirt, I think it's equally misinformed and misplaced to say, well, let's find out what the guy was reading that night before we went out on a prowl, because after all, he's not responsible. She made him do it, either a picture of her or, you know, the fact that the woman he picked up was walking by herself. I think rape needs to be looked at in the context of the violence of this culture, which is a very serious problem and has a good deal less to do with sex than it does with violence. And when I offered the information about the low content in sexually explicit imagery, forget Playboy, I mean sexually explicit imagery of violence, I offered it in some sense as some comfort, because I think we would all be very troubled if in fact what we found was that 95% of the sexually explicit material out there had themes of rape and abuse in them. The truth is they don't. If you watch very many X-rated movies, and frankly they're pretty boring so I don't watch very many, they are very repetitious themes of people screwing in lots of different positions with lots of different partners, and they don't involve the violence that would trouble you. And at the end of the day, if we were to say that we wanted to remove everything that was violent from the culture, from our books and from our plays and from our films and from our magazines, if you step back for a minute and forget about Wanda Whip's Wall Street, which everybody says, well, who cares if we lost that, and start thinking about Leda and the Swan and Shakespeare and Killing Fields and all that is in our culture that does reflect violence, because it is in our culture, I think you'd be fairly quickly at a point where it would be very difficult to imagine how such an ordinance under any construct would work. And I thought it was very interesting that the judge in Indianapolis who ruled that that ordinance was unconstitutional was a woman, because I thought it was interesting that what she wrote was how the way to affect an attitude is to promote the attitude you want. That at the end of the day, you're never successful in suppressing an attitude. You're successful in counter-programming, if you will. And the truth is that if the last 30 years represented an explosion of the available of sexual imagery, they also reflected and represented the biggest gains women have ever made in their lives in this country in terms of equal rights and equal opportunity. So maybe, in fact, it is possible to promote the kind of ideal and idea about women and their place in the society and all of the aspects of society at the same time that there is a sorting out going on in the marketplace of sexual imagery. On the last question in terms of me and Playboy, I obviously look at it from a completely unique perspective, and that gives me certain advantages and it also gives me certain blind sides. The advantages are that I know my father, not intimately, but I've known him all my life. I know the people who put out the magazine, and in fact, if you look at the masthead of Playboy, you'll find far more women than you will on the news weeklies in positions of management, and that isn't something I did. That's something that was there when I came to the company. I know what those people believe in. I also read the magazine. I also read the research and the letters of the readers. And a lot of the people who are troubled by either a woman like me at Playboy or even Playboy in and of itself don't have that information. And so what they have is their own uncomfortableness with the magazine, which is as emotionally legitimate as my comfortableness. But it has to be understood as a personal reaction, like a Rorschach test, more than the analysis of a message that's being given and received, which is to say that if the concern is that the magazine sends a message which is received by the readers, that women are not, should not be treated like men, that women are there for the sexual gratification of men, that women are some species to be sort of used at the will of men, or some variation on that, the reality of what is in the magazine and the attitudes of the people who read it is 180 degrees from that. And because I know that, it doesn't trouble me, although I'd prefer it to be otherwise, that some people are not comfortable with the magazine. And at the end of the day, it seems to me what women want to do is to give as many choices to women as possible, to express every part of themselves. And I happen to think it's sort of terrific that a woman is running a New York Stock Exchange company, but I also don't have any problem with the notion that women who are really attractive and want to make some money while they're young modeling, whether it's for Playboy or for glamour, get paid and do that. Because it doesn't seem to me that I should be in the business of saying, well, you should only want to be a lawyer because that's the only politically acceptable thing to do. Because men told women what was politically acceptable for 100 years, and I don't think women need other women telling them that. Those women exploit their good looks for money just like athletes exploit their ability for money. They don't feel exploited. They aren't exploited in their working conditions. And at the end of the day, if we're back to the thing that really troubles us, which is violent images of sexuality, then we ought to be a little more supportive of the nonviolent romantic images that are out there, because ultimately it will be a question of what imagery is out there that helps to shape the views that are out there. We'll never get rid of the imagery. You know, in Victorian times, everything was illegal, but there was a real market in dirty postcards. So the idea is, what are you going to celebrate out there, not what are you going to suppress? Yeah.
Ms. Hefner, I just wanted to applaud in a major way your comments regarding child abuse and what the images that you publish have to do with that. And I'm in a very unique situation in that I've worked both with the offenders in a psychiatric setting and with the kids who have been abused, currently at McLean Hospital in the Boston area. And you know, I know from experience in dealing with these people, incidentally, the nursing staff, which I am on, are the ones who spend more time than anybody else in the hospital with the patients. We're the ones that know them like the back of our hands, can predict the things that they'll do and say, and whether or not they'll abuse again. And I know from working with these people that the reason kids have been abused and the reason the offenders have abused in a sexual or physical way has had little to do with sex and a lot more to do with violence and anger. And just to give an anecdotal example, there was a certain psychopath who had raped a 75-year-old woman who I worked with and spent a lot of time with. And I was one who would be very confrontive with him and say things like, oh, you don't like women? Well, I know of a bar that you could go to where most of the women there could talk you under the table. And he responded very well to that because it was true, and he knew it. And when I left there, he was the one to organize a going away party for me in appreciation of all the good work that I had done with him.
Thank you.
I come from the other side of the river, the business school, where more and more these days we're not only concerned with what's legal, but what's ethical. And
I hear there's a lot of money in that these days.
all legal issues aside, I'm interested in something that's on people's minds and on some people's coffee tables this month. Vanna White. Let's say that it's totally legal that Playboy had the rights to publish those pictures. How right is it? How ethical is it? She didn't want them published, and you went ahead and did it anyway. No.
Well, let me tell you the story, because I too come from a school, not an academic one, but the real world where ethics are important. And in fact, by way of a backdrop, Playboy magazine was offered the pictures of Vanessa Williams initially, and we refused to publish them, not because anybody thought that they wouldn't sell a whole lot of copies, which in fact they did, of Penthouse, but because we felt very strongly that they were pictures that were not intended for publication, regardless of whether ultimately the release turned out to be legal or not, that they were pictures that, if they were published while she was Miss America, and it had a special meaning as the first black Miss America, in our view, they would clearly destroy her career, and that was, in fact, the business of exploitation, not the business of celebration, and we didn't publish them. The Vanna White situation is a dramatically different situation. When those pictures were bought by Playboy, they were pictures that were posed for publication. In fact, a couple of them had been published at a period where she was modeling lingerie and did so on television as well as in film. And she took those pictures to Hefner, who was a friend, to talk about being in the magazine back in 1982 when they were shot. And for a variety of reasons, she was never photographed for the magazine. When the magazine bought those pictures back in August, Hefner went to Vanna and said, "We have these pictures," and she said, "Can you hold the publication until my book comes out, because I write about that period in my life. And if you hold those pictures until my book comes out, we can talk about my doing a cover or some promotion for the magazine." And we did. We held those pictures past the time when, frankly, they would have been the most commercial, because I think her career peaked a couple of months ago. I may be wrong about that. It's incredible to me it peaked at all, but so what do I know? And we held them until the May issue because her book comes out in April. What happened subsequently was that she got very nervous, afraid that some of the more conservative sponsors with whom she was signing endorsement deals would not be happy about the pictures, although if you've seen them, you know that they are not sleazy pictures. They're not embarrassing pictures in any sense of the way, for example, the Vanessa Williams pictures were clearly shocking pictures to people. And she decided to change her mind and both sued the magazine and then subsequently in her book lied about some other pictures that were taken when she was sunbathing topless at the Playboy mansion, and she claims were taken with a telephoto lens when she was sunbathing at her own home. And she's since been deposed on this, which is why I can talk about it, and she's had to tell the truth in the deposition. So to me, that's a case of a person I don't know very well. My father thinks is a very sweet person, so I will take his word for it, getting very bad advice from people who panicked in a way that will ultimately not only sell more copies of the magazine, which if she doesn't want the pictures out doesn't suit her purposes, but embarrass her further as more revelations come out about what really happened. So I do think that there are ethics beyond the law in issues of contract law and in issues like this. And I am comfortable with the ethics of having not published the Vanessa Williams pictures and comfortable with the ethics on this one. I regret, frankly, that she filed suit because even though the circulation director of the magazine was thrilled, I think it does cast a dark cloud over it and that it's not to anybody's benefit. And obviously, lawyers' fees being what they are, you all can look forward to this someday. It's going to, it's going to cost hundreds of thousands of dollars in litigation as well. But the reality of the facts of that are one where I don't have any problem with it.
You talked about the difficulties of line drawing, and you gave us Brennan's version, and you've obviously got some problems with line drawing. But do you think there can be a line in obscenity, and can you draw one? Do you draw any lines at all, or is everything okay? Slashers, everything. Slasher magazine.
Well, actually, slasher magazines aren't against the law. I think that's an important point to understand. You can have the most violent imagery, whether it's in magazines or in film, and it isn't prosecutable under the obscenity laws unless it appeals to the prurient interest and has a sexual content. In fact, I almost thought that this was a bad joke, but I found out it was true. One of the 7-Elevens that took Playboy magazine out when the Mies Commission letter arrived literally replaced the magazine with a gun rack. I kid you not. There was something somehow very odd to me about the fact that kids could go in and buy Guns and Ammo magazine, but we're not going to be allowed to look at Playboy. So the truth is that if the concern is violent imagery, obscenity statutes aren't going to help you at all in that regard. As to what I think, we live with the obscenity statutes and live with them comfortably because they have come to mean something so hardcore and extreme that they don't intrude upon anything that we do. Do I think that it's ultimately either wise or easy to draw those lines? Truthfully, I don't, because if you look at the way the obscenity laws are being prosecuted, it's very haphazard and random, and you don't see violence particularly being attacked. All those, what I think are sort of truly despicable, I Spit in Your Grave, Part 3D, are all out there in the video stores in Virginia, in Arlington County, and what's gone are the explicit tapes of people having sex. So if I were going to draw a line, I'd be much more apt to go after violence than sex to begin with. But at the end of the day, I think you have trouble, in fact, writing something that's easily